monks, because although living in monasteries under monastic discipline, they devoted themselves primarily to pastoral works instead of ascetic and liturgical practices, combining the active and the contemplative way of life and bringing the fruit of the monastic piety to the laity. Francis and Dominic were both revered saints, even in their own lifetime, and were formally canonized only a few years after their death. Other orders? Among the groups that were organized by this mendicant order is the Carmelites. The Carmelites, a third of the mendicant orders, were founded in Holy Land in 1209 by Englishman Saint Simon Stock. He was made up of hermits living in Mount Carmel and came to Europe a generation later. Another is the Servites. The Order of the Servants of Mary were founded around 1300 in the highly prosperous city of Florence by a small group of noblemen who were dissatisfied with their city's worldliness. Nuns and tertiaries and friars. Both the order and newer religious orders had female branches. A disciple of Francis named Clare founded a community of poor ladies who at first did charitable work in the world, but shortly thereafter officially recognized the communities of women were required to be cloistered, a rule the poor Charles or Clares were obliged to follow. Both Franciscan and Dominican established third orders, tertiaries, for lay people who live in the world, but to some extent shared in the life of vowed religious. Thus, in this age, in the church history, is called the age of the friars. In some way, the high Middle Ages were the age of the friars in the same way that earlier centuries had been the age of the monks. The Franciscans' unique combination of austerity and joy made them the most popular of religious communities, attracting 30,000 members in their first century. Though starting to preach a simple, heartfelt message, the intellectual life soon was realized by the group. Francis intended for his friars to preach a simple, heartfelt message and to eschew the intellectual life. But the prestige and importance of the university was such that almost immediately both Franciscans and Dominicans began pursuing advanced studies. Controversy of the Fraticelli. The Franciscan movement also became the focus of prolonged and often bitter controversy, resented by many of the secular clergy as intruders into pastoral life, but consistently supported by the papacy. A faction of the friar called the Fraticelli, little brothers, or spirituals, demanded that poverty be practiced very rigorously and were severe critics of clergy who did not do so. Some of the spirituals adopted the Joachite prophecy concerning the third days of the church and claimed that they would be the means of bringing it into being. A general of the Franciscans and a cardinal, Saint Bonaventure, 1274, opposed the Fraticelli, who were condemned, but continued to be a vital movement. Wealth and poverty. The corrupting effect of riches is considered the snare of wealth. Medieval people were repeatedly warned against it. The renunciation of worldly goods were highly praised. But this presented a dilemma, because those who held high social positions, including the clergy, were expected to live in a style commensurate with their rank, so that those who did renounce their wealth virtually had to become monks. Privileged people were therefore supposed to practice inner detachment, and after death some bishops were discovered to have been wearing hair shirts beneath their splendid robes. Innocent III, the medieval pope most involved in worldly matters, wrote a standard treatise on the familiar theme of contempt for the world and recognized the importance of poverty. Those who were rich are expected to be generous to their charities, which was the reason God has given them wealth. There were few charities organized by the government as such, so that the needy depended on monasteries and on lay and clerical lords who distributed alms and endowed schools, hospitals, orphanages, leprosaria, and other institutions. Money was thought to be sterile and therefore could not reproduce itself. Being thus, usury was forbidden. It was the merchant, not necessarily the feudal lord whose wealth was on the land, who is presented as usurious. Thus, money lending became the province of the Jews. But gradually the concept of money being an investment, began to develop, and that the banking houses in Italy became connected with trade, that even the papacy was working closely with those banking houses. It was a church that propounded on the ideal of justice for the sake of the common good. The church attempted to balance the interests of producers and consumers by condemning the vice of greed and encouraging just wages and just prices undertaken by guilds and town governments. At that time, rising prosperity for the Christian conscience was not wholly at ease with, often seen as both the cause and the result of greed, and as something that distracted people from their heavenly goal. Heterodox reform. The concept of reform was primarily a return to the apostolic life of simplicity and poverty. The program of reform led to the demand of a pure Christianity, some that resulted in a heretical situation when they went beyond the condemnation of clerical abuses and denied the authority of the clerical office itself and of the sacramental system. The deviant groups and deterrents. Such groups include Tachim. He is a layman who put first the monk's robe and preached in the fields, calling the church a brothel and sacraments a pollution. Then put on regal garments and declared himself betrothed of the Virgin Mary. He was killed in an armed skirmish. The Chaim movement may have given rise to the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organized network of people who repudiated the church and exalted semi-ecstatic mythical experiences as movement and survived for several centuries. Another one is Waldo was a merchant who, unheard of for a layman, translated the Bible into French, and on that basis concluded that the church was corrupt. He sold all his goods, abandoned his wife, and began preaching, attracting followers who were called the poor men of Lyons, the city where Waldo resided. He was expelled from Lyons in 1185, and his fate is unknown, although his movement, while never large, spread fairly widely. After Waldo's death, the poor men constituted a direct attack to the institutional character of the church, hierarchy, priesthood, and sacraments, purgatory. Each believer was thought to be inspired directly by the Holy Spirit, and the renunciation of property was the principal sign of authentic faith. Another group was started by Joachim of Flora, who preached millenarism, often a feature of sectarian belief. He was a worldly Italian nobleman who underwent conversion of heart while in the Crusades, became a Cistercian, and was elected abbot, but abandoned that office to expound what he claimed were the hidden meanings of Scripture. He preached 3 ages, each guided by one of the persons of the Trinity. He taught that the visible church was coming to an end, and the age of the Holy Spirit began about 1260 would be characterized by a holy spiritual faith, anticipating the imminent end of the world and opposing most institutional forms of religion. The Beguines and the Beggars is a reform movement deeply influenced by piety. Beguines and Beggars are respectively female and male groups that began in the Low Countries in the 12th century. These groups were made up of lay people who were self-supporting and engaged in works of charity, but who also took vows of chastity and lived in communities which were free to live. They developed a mysticism that was quite contrary to the church. They were condemned by various councils as they fell into the error of quietism. Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade. By far is the major deviant religious movement of the Middle Ages, was led by the Cathars, or the Pure Ones, who began in the Near East with a species of Gnosticism or Manichaeism, made their way westward through the Balkans, and found a home in southern France, where they came to be called Albigensians, from the town of Albi. They were organized as a church with their own clergy and dioceses. The Catholicism was scarcely a Christian heresy at all, but a rival religion based on an extreme dualism of matter and spirit, postulating a universe divided between the opposed divinities, and whom the biblical God was the God of evil, and the church was the invention of Satan. The Cathars preached perfection for the few perfect, and antinomianism for the many. Believers has condemned marriages because human sexuality is inherently evil, and the procreation of children traps soul in the bodies. The perfect refrained from sexual activity, while the believers were allowed free sex, but were not supposed to procreate. When a papal legate was murdered in 1208, Innocent III proclaimed a crusade that captured several Cathar strongholds, committing atrocities in the process. Their protector Raymond ostensibly repented, regained his lands, then again began protecting the Cathars. He was born a heretic. The movement gradually died out. The deviant group sometimes resorted to deviant behaviors. They were prodded by a belief in heretical ideals. In order to understand them, there was a need to determine the nature of heresy. Heresy was considered spiritual disease or infections that, if allowed to spread, would poison the entire community. Since God has revealed the truth to his church, heretics were considered obstinately blind for having departed from the truth, motivated by pride and self-will rather than simple ignorance. In order to determine whether a group is deviant or not, there is a need to inquire. Thus, the Inquisition is needed. It is the judicial processes later institutionalized in the Inquisitions were first employed in 1022, when 12 canons of Orleans were burned at the stake, accused of denying the most fundamental doctrines of the faith, such as the creation of the world by God. The Inquisition, established in 1184, was directly under papal authority. Every diocese was ordered to have one office charged with ferreting out the heresy, but in time the entire responsibility was given to the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Inquisition simply means an inquiry that followed the procedures of Roman law, whereby an accusation in itself establishes some presumption of guilt. The accused, although not permitted to confront his accusers, could submit a list of their enemies, whose testimony was then inadmissible. The accused were allowed to answer the charges and were sometimes allowed to have counsel. Torture was permitted in order to obtain a confession, but it was used sparingly in heresy cases, since an individual denied being a heretic was considered to have recanted. Defendants were often acquitted, convictions would be appealed to the Pope, and were sometimes overturned, and occasionally an overzealous inquisitor was removed and punished by the Holy See. The chief purpose of the Inquisition was to persuade the accused heretic to recant, in which case he was made to do public penance, sometimes put heretics to death, because heresy was regarded as a destruction or destructive to social order. The Justinian Code provided for the death penalty, although some churchmen, notably Bernard, protested the practice. After the execution at Orleans, there were almost no executions for 2 centuries. Innocent III defined heresy as treason against God, but did not authorize the death penalty, and the Fourth Lateran Council merely imposed banishment. Non-deviant heterodox group. One group who did not attack the church is the Humiliati, the humble ones. They were a lay group founded in Italy in the late 12th century and composed both of men and women, single and married, who tried to live a simple life. They did not attack the church and were approved by Innocent III, who allowed them to preach about morality, but not about doctrine, based on the people's judgment, and they led good Christian lives, but they are not learned in theology. The Crusades in Europe. Purposes of the Crusade. Crusade, War of the Cross, served several purposes: retaking the Holy Land from the Muslims, making pilgrimages once again possible, demonstrating concretely the unity of Christendom, and providing the European nobility with a worthy cause for their warlike spirit. Crusaders were invested with a cloak bearing the sign of the cross, and their property was placed under the protection of the church during their absence. Traditionally, to pilgrimages are attached indulgences, and so the Crusaders took pilgrims' vows, and who in turn received the indulgences traditionally attached to such pilgrimages. Grants by the church that offered a remission of punishment deserved for one's sin, both in this life and in purgatory. A remission that could be applied to the soul in the deceased as well. Sometimes those who impulsively took the vow later asked to be dispensed and were allowed to redeem it by a monetary payment in support of the crusade, a practice that went into what they think as the sale of indulgences. The warlike spirit of the European nobility responded to the Crusaders' call. God wills it, and they exemplified both the highest and the lowest aspects of medieval civilization. The Crusades could not have been mounted without an overriding religious passion, and turned warlike impulses outward, and the original motives of those who volunteered were almost always pious. Since the expense was huge, the chance of returning was equally great. Inevitably, however, there were opportunities for gratuitous brutality and greed. In order to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims, the Crusaders aroused popular militia belief that were never far beneath the surface, with the recapture of the Holy Land seen as the immediate preliminary for the Second Coming. The Jews would have considered to be an obstacle to that undertaking, although local bishops made some effort to protect them. The Jews were sometimes robbed and massacred by crusading armies marching through Europe, apparently in the belief that the Jews were as great an obstacle for a Christian claim to the Holy Land as were the Muslims. Some crusade preachers openly advocated anti-Jewish violence, although Bernard, who preached the Second Crusade, condemned it. All of these movements ignited popular enthusiasm in the continent. The Crusades awakened powerful and unpredictable emotions in people. Secular and ecclesiastical authorities opposed hysteria but could not stem the emotion that made the Crusaders into a genuinely popular movement. During the First Crusade, a charismatic preacher called Peter the Hermit attacked 20,000 volunteers to a colonne called the People's Crusade. In 1212, the Children's Crusade lured away thousands. Not all of them were children. Many of them were never returned. In 1251, hordes of poor people called pastoreaux, shepherds, rampaged through France under the direction of a mysterious figure called the Master of Hungary, demanding the liberation of the holy places and assaulting and even killing clergy. The movement was put down by Louis XIV. The thrust for the conversion of Europe, fueled by this frenzy, became a further sign of the medieval revival. It resulted in the conversion of the few remaining pagan areas of the Europe. The Magyars of Hungary were converted in the early 11th century. The Poles conquered the Wends in northeastern Europe in 1121 and began to re-Christianize them. Christianity was thus extended along the Baltic coast, modern Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, partly by force and partly by missionary effort. Despite this, progress was precarious. As late as 1261, a Lithuanian king apostatized, destroyed his cathedral, and built a pagan temple in its place. However, a royal marriage to a Polish princess in 1385 permanently restored Catholicism. The church gained a foothold in Finland around 1200, but the Lapps of the north remained pagan, the last European people to do so. Against the Muslim, a successful thrust called the Reconquista came about where the Muslims were forced back in Western Europe during the 11th century, entirely expelled from Sicily by the Normans and slowly pushed back by the Spaniards. In 1035, Catholic Spain was divided into the kingdoms of Navarre, Castile, and Aragon, with Castile gradually assuming leadership in the age of the legendary hero El Cid, the Lord, 1099. By 1100, Muslim Spain has been reduced to a collection of small principalities. The Reconquest led to the Crusade ideal being applied to Europe as well as the Holy Land. However, a new Muslim invasion from Africa as well as dissension among the Christians themselves impeded the reconquest that was the dominant reality of medieval Spain. In 1212, an expedition of all Spanish Catholic states inflicted a major defeat in the Muslims, and in 1239, the King of Castile, Saint Ferdinand III, 1217-1252, took Cordoba and forced the Muslims to reestablish their caliphate yet farther south at Granada, the last remaining Muslim state in the peninsula. Devotional life. As far as the devotional life of the Church, the medieval period saw the development and contributed to a positive development of spirituality. We have asceticism, disciplining oneself to submit to God's will, was the dominant moral ideal of the Middle Ages, manifest most perfectly by monks and nuns, but enjoined in one's degree or another on everyone by fasting, the penitent acceptance of the suffering in others. Moreover, the development of prayer books for the laity, enabling the illiterate minority or the literate minority to perform their private devotions. Books of hours, the divine office. The books were in Latin, since this were the illiterate could read that sacred language. For the clerics, the value of preaching was provided for priests. Some read a homily from one of the fathers of the church. Homilies were expositions of the scripture of the daily mass. Sermons were made on a variety of subjects and were increasingly preached outside mass. In large churches, sermons were no longer delivered from the sanctuary or the holy place, but from the pulpits, the platforms, erected halfway along the nave to enable everyone to hear. Popular devotions. In popular devotions, we have the pilgrimages. A few people were able to travel to the Holy Land, and some never were able to return. While in Europe itself, the most revered destinations were Rome and the shrine of St. James of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The increase in the piety of the people were manifested in the devotion to the human Jesus, an intimacy begun by Bernard, in contrast to the earlier Western emphasis on Jesus as judge of the living and the dead, and the Byzantine sense of his remoteness. Whereas in the earlier centuries the passion of Christ was overshadowed by his resurrection, devotion to his passion, including intense personal sorrow, now became a hallmark of piety. The crucifix has been a grim reminder of the judgment awaiting all people, but now became an object of compassion, steering the faithful to share in Christ's sufferings. Devotion to Jesus and his Sacred Heart grew, promoted especially by two nuns, the Fleming Saint Lutgardis of Iverace, 1246, and the German Saint Gertrude the Great, 1302, both of whom experienced mystical union with the heart of Christ. These devotions to the human Jesus, further enhanced by St. Francis' introduction of the Creche, or Nativity Scene, into the popular devotion. In the former liturgy, Christ is seldom addressed directly. People were increasingly encouraged to pray to him in their private devotions. Novenas, which have become very popular by the High Middle Ages, were a series of prayers of devotion spread out over 9 days or 9 weeks, possibly because of the 9 days Jesus' apostles and disciples spent in the upper room after his ascension. This devotional fervor was extended to the Blessed Virgin. Through the Marian piety, the faithful sought the loving Mother to intercede for them with her Son, mitigating the demands of strict justice by mercy, another step in the process of which the harshness of a warrior culture was softened by other emotions. The principal Marian feasts were the Purification, the Annunciation, the Assumption, and her Nativity, and in time a special office of the Blessed Virgin was introduced. Even the monasteries required to have a lady chapel, and that it dedicated Saturday to Mary. Marian shrine became major pilgrimages, and numerous churches and cathedrals were dedicated to Mary. The loving greeting, the Hail Mary, evoked the Annunciation, the moment when Mary was given her divine commission, her free acceptance depicted already in the Roman catacombs. The Rosary, with its continued repetition of that prayer, was first promoted by the early Dominicans. The public recitation of the Angelus, the angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, was introduced in the 14th century. Added to that is the Marian title, was extended to Mary from the Song of Songs, which had traditionally been understood as expressing the love of Christ for his church or relationship of Christ to the soul, was now increasingly understood as referring to Mary. From it, new Marian titles were taken, such as Star of the Sea, who guides voyager across the treacherous waters of life. Devotions to the Sorrowful Mother was encouraged, evoking the 7 sorrows of Mary, the prophecies of Simeon, a sword shall pierce your soul, the flight to Egypt, the temporary loss of the boy Jesus in the temple, the carrying of his cross, the crucifixion, taking down his body from the cross, and his burial. Along with this was the devotion to the triumphant Mary in the title Assumption. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception developed the devotion to Mary as the foretaste of the beatific vision. Other divisions like that of Loreto developed. Other practices of note. The prayers for the dead was an urgent reply to the widely held belief that only the saintly minority would be saved. The practice of praying for the dead, a special urgency. Also the devotion to the saints. The Italian Dominican Archbishop Jacopo de Voragine compiled the Golden Legends, the greatest collection of saints' lives up to the time, and the source of many later stories. The word legend in the Middle Ages did not imply untruth, but merely literally something to be read. A class of lay saints include the saintly royalty, honored for their not for their political achievement, than by their piety and devotion to the church. And finally, the credulity about relics developed, where notable collections became pilgrimage places and were sources of considerable revenue to the local community. Marriage. The Church took to heart the validity of marriage, defining the degree of blood relationship within which valid marriage could occur. requiring the free consent of the spouses, allowing an unconsummated marriage to be annulled, made nothing, and required a liturgical ceremony, although a marriage was considered valid so long as it could be shown that the couple had made a verbal commitment to each other. Divorce, literally a split or cutting, did not exist in the sense of dissolution of a valid marriage, but church courts decided numerous appeals for separation based on the serious misconduct of one of the spouses. The marriage bed was also solemnly blessed before being occupied, and after childbirth, the new mother underwent the ceremony of churching as a kind of ritual purification, in others as a kind of ritual honor to the motherhood. Theologians took on increasingly positive view of marriage as not merely a remedy for concupiscence, as Paul implied in one place, but as a divinely ordained sacrament, modeled on the relationship between Christ and his church, as Paul said in another. The emphasis was on procreation, which contrasted with the culture of courtly love, which required the avoidance of pregnancy. Thus the church reiterates strongly that the purpose of marriage is procreation. Some theologians also justified marital sex in the Pauline ground that it forestalled adultery. Aquinas considered sexual pleasure to be an inducement to the act of procreation and not necessarily sinful. And so the value of lay vocation was assumed to be monastic life, which in itself was considered superior to the life in the world. There was even a point where married couples were allowed to separate in order to enter religious life. But monastic life had its own temptations, so that a good layman might have a higher place in heaven than an indifferent monk. Marriage being an ideal, we find the concept of divorce to be an issue with the monarchs anywhere often at odds with. They married and divorced in order to cement diplomatic alliances or promote their dynasties. This political reason for marriage often resulted in arranged marriages for dynastic or economic purposes, and while prevailing custom did not make love a prerequisite for marriage, it was hoped that love would grow throughout the life of the married couple. Perhaps inevitably, therefore, alongside the Christian ideal of marriage, thus developed the culture of courtly love, so-called because it was popular in the courts of the nobility. The medieval romances, so-called because, as vernacular French, they were derived from the language of Rome, revived the sense of love as a sexual passion deeply rooted in the soul, something celebrated among the ancients, but largely ignored in early Christianity. Courtly love usually celebrated an attraction between a man and a woman who were not married to each other, an attraction that sometimes culminated in adultery, as in the story of the legendary King Arthur of Britain, whose queen Guinevere and his best friend knight Lancelot had an affair that destroyed the mythical kingdom of Camelot. This courtly love was related by troubadours. The courtly love movement originated in southern France and probably owed much to the Arabic sources, as well as in the Qatar. It was spread by traveling singers called troubadours, both male and female, the origin of whose name is uncertain. Courtly love celebrated an openly hedonistic way of life. A redeeming development in the knight and lady as it spread north, courtly love was modified in accord with attempts to Christianize the warrior spirit through the code of chivalry, in which the lady was idealized and unattainable, while the knight served her unselfishly. The titles of Our Lord and Our Lady, which became the most familiar ways of speaking of Jesus and Mary, were an outgrowth of this, transferring to them absolutely the conditional fidelity owed to one's feudal superiors. Pious knights vowed themselves to Mary's service. Liturgy. The basic form of the Mass had been set during the Carolingian period, and after being adopted at Rome, became known as the Roman Rite or the Western Rites. It has a few alternative rites with minor variations. The Ambrosians in Milan, the Gallican in part of France, the Mozarabic in Spain, the Sarum in England. At the sacraments, particularly the Mass, the concept of ex opere operato became focal. A recurring heresy dating at least as far back as the Donatists held that the validity of the sacraments depended upon the personal worthiness of the priest. Medieval theologians countered this with the doctrine that if celebrated according to the proper form, the sacraments are valid ex opere operato, literally from the work having worked. That is, through the power of the ordained priesthood, independent of the priest's moral character. the development of the basic form of the Mass. In the High Middle Ages, significant additions came about, like the Confite or I Confess, became a part of the Mass after 1200, and the Gloria in the 11th century, although for some time, except on Easter, it was sung only by the bishop. The Creed, too, was introduced during that century. By the 13th century, the congregation commonly knelt before the Santos until communion, and amidst the silence of the canon were alerted to the impending consecration by the ringing of a bell. Whereas formerly the regular elements have been shown to the people only at the end of the canon, through him, with him, in him. The major elevation followed the consecration was now added. The elevation of the chalice was not required until the 16th century, on the ground that when it was elevated, the faithful did not actually see the blood of Christ. Often the church bells were rung at the consecration to signal to those outside the church that the miracle has occurred. At the end of the canon, it was customary to bless various things connected with the people's work: fruit, lamb, bread, milk, honey. Part of the private prayers as the Lord Last Gospel, the Confiteor, were incorporated into the Mass officially. By the 13th century, liturgical colors were adopted for the chasuble to symbolize the liturgical season, and eventually the colors were standardized: white for the Feast of Christ and for virgins and confessors, red for martyrs, purple for penitential seasons of Lent and Advent, green for the long period after Pentecost, black for the dead. During this time, the place the late at Mass depended on the size of the community. For larger churches, permanent rod screens surmounted by the crucifixes and other sacred images were often erected to separate the nave from the sanctuary. The sheer size of some worshiping communities led to other significant changes, such as no longer administering the chalice to the laity. But it was only in larger towns and monasteries that size presented a problem, since most people live in villages where Mass was celebrated in a rather small space with the whole community present. Music was also incorporated or integral to the divine worship in larger churches, an expression of the divine harmony of the universe itself, closely linked to the mathematics of the quadrivium. In Platonic terms, a means thereby the soul could rise above the mundane things and enter the heavenly realm. Anselm, however, warned that music existed not for itself, but in order to lure the listener into paying attention to the divine words. Chanting was both in praise of God and to allow the spirit of the liturgy to penetrate deeply into the soul through repetition. Cluny pioneered the practice of placing its monks in choir stalls, two groups facing each other and chanting antiphonally, or against the sound. Besides plain chant, increasingly by elaborate polyphonic masses were being composed in the 13th century, now often sung by professional lay choirs, located in high lofts above the entrance of the church. Even sacred drama was an outgrowth of the liturgy, originally with the cleric's investment in acting scenes of the gospel in the body of the church, that in time plays were written in gospel subjects and performed with increasing elaborateness by professional actors spilling out of the church and into the town squares. Fervent Eucharistic piety grew with Eucharistic hymns of St. Thomas Aquinas, O Salutaris Ostia, O Saving Host. The new Feast of Corpus Christi, Body of Christ, with processions winding through the street, was established in the 13th century, and the practice of exposing the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance, or showing, a little later. But paradoxically, this piety accompanied a decline in the reception of the communion. Gazing prayerfully at the sacred elements became a kind of a substitute, culminating in spiritual communion with Jesus in one's heart. Festivals were also based on the liturgy, which was fundamentally joyous, the enactment of the redemption itself, and this joy spilled over into communal celebration that took on a worldly, even profane character. Mardi Gras, the Fast Tuesday, was a day in which the people consumed whatever meat and lard they still have before the Lenten fast began. And in Latin, Lans became carnival, farewell to the flesh, an excuse for riotous behavior. The Fourth Lateran Council defined 7 sacraments as the visible form of invisible reality and the principal channels of divine grace, 6 of which were established by Jesus directly, while matrimony has been decreed by God in the Garden of Eden. Before that, they were rather loosely used, referring to virtually any sacred things. Somewhat later, the term sacramental came to be used for objects such as holy water and crucifixes related to the sacraments. The cope, which was originally a cape worn around the cold, and a shortened arm called the supplice, something worn above, were vestments worn by priests at ceremonies other than the Mass itself. Of the seven sacraments, penance was the confession of sin openly at Mass and receive ablution. In the 11th century, the people might confess their sin openly at Mass. For mortal sins, private confession was still required. An absolution was not ordinarily granted at the time of the confession, but only after the penitent has completed a very demanding penance. The use of revised penitentials spread, partly on the assumption that many priests were not skilled in the care of souls and needed to follow a guidebook that delineated the various sins and indicated how they were to be treated. For the same reason, the friars were given faculties to hear confession, because they were often better educated than the diocesan clergy and were perhaps thought to be more devout, a policy that seemed to undercut the parish system and became a principal cause of animosity between the friars. Absolute secrecy was enjoined in the confessor, who were told not even to look at the penitent, and one of the gravest sin of all, reserved to the Holy See itself for absolution, was a confessor's soliciting of sexual favors from a penitent. The last things. Even in the midst of growing prosperity, the hour of death reminds people to cultivate the virtue of contributing to salvation and avoid the corresponding vices leading to hell. Good and bad acts were both taught as being kept meticulously in a book that was open at the gates of paradise, where angels weigh souls in a balance. The hour of our death was crucial because it was at that final moment, as angels and devils fought over the soul of the dying man, that salvation or damnation was determined, the deathbed conversion of the sinner being one of the most dramatic and often told stories. People were judged immediately after death, a judgment that was ratified in the general judgment at the end of the world, in keeping with Jesus' warning. The end times were dreaded, so that the poem Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, was eventually incorporated into the Mass for the dead. Cluny was the first community to celebrate the Feast of All Souls around 1050, and it was eventually extended to the entire church. For a time, the only feast on which a priest might celebrate more than one Mass. Funerals were as elaborate as a family could afford, the body wrapped in a shroud and carried in open bier to the grave while praying or chanting psalms. Prayers for the dead was piously made even to the extent of providing endowment to support mass priests, those without a regular benefice, whose sole duty was to pray for the soul of the donor. Special altars and even whole chapels were built into the churches for that purpose. The last will and testament was under the jurisdiction of the church courts because it was a witness or a testament to the will of the wishes of the deceased, of the state of his soul at the time of death, hence an indication of his faith. The legacy was a crucial opportunity for manifesting one's faith and doing penance for other sins by leaving money for worthy purposes. Sacred architecture, styles. The greatest manifestation of Christendom's recovery after 1000 were in the realm of high culture, particular architecture. With a few exceptions, such as Charlemagne Chapel at Aachen, church building declined during the Dark Ages, but soon after a symbolic date 1000 has been passed, a monk noted that the landscape was now dotted with the white stones of new churches. In some ways, the building of those Catholic megaliths was the most telling sign of the recovery of civilization. Church building reflected the complex unity of the Christian society, in that besides piety, it required wealth, technical skill, and civic pride. The great church, intended to last for centuries, was an act of faith not only in God, but in the future of the city as well. Eastern architecture styles survived in Italy, especially at Ravenna, which was the Byzantine capital of the West, and at Venice, St. Mark's Basilica, because of its close commercial ties with the East. But the recovery of the West primarily manifested itself in new architectural style. Romanesque architecture began in the 11th century, developing from the Roman basilica style, but with much larger structures, some rising more than 100 feet and holding several thousand worshippers. Great churches crowned with domes continued to be built in the East, but the West expressed its aspiration for God by building higher and higher, with towers and steeples pointing to heaven. To sustain their height, Romanesque churches had massive walls, huge pillars, and rounded ceilings. The interior walls were often painted with biblical scenes, and the columns were rich in sculpture, all of which had religious significance, but also expressed vivid imagination of the artist. Signs of the zodiac, exotic plants and animals, mythical monsters. The Gothic, meaning barbaric and crude, style of architecture, as it was later disrespectfully dubbed, was made possible by certain innovations in building techniques, especially the high vaulted arch and the roof of the flying buttresses, masonry structure that supported the walls from the outside, thereby alleviating the need for massive pillars on the inside. Like the Romanesque, the initial impression of the Gothic was of a building reaching up to heaven. But the great significance of the Gothic, in contrast to the Romanesque, was the high lightness of its structure. Slender soaring pillars and relatively thin walls, allowing those walls to be opened by several levels of windows, thereby infusing interior with a richness of light, not possible in the Romanesque building. A natural light transformed as it passes through rows of stained glass windows. The cathedral at Chartres, begun in 1194, is the most famous and best preserved example of the Gothic, the circumstance of its construction perfectly expressing the spirit of medieval piety. After the old cathedral burned down, the townspeople at first considered a divine judgment and decided not to rebuild. But when the town's most celebrated relic, the cloak of the Virgin Mary, was found on the ruins, this was taken as a sign they erect an even greater structure. Significance. Over the portals of many of the great churches was the triumphant scene of Christ reigning in glory and sitting in judgment over the souls of men, decreeing who would share in the heavenly glory and who would be cast into hell. As worshippers entered the church, their minds were turned to the purpose of their existence on earth and need to make themselves worthy to pass through that heavenly portals. The entire church building serves as a course of instruction on the mystery of salvation, with both sculptured figures and painted glass representing characters in the Old Testament, prefiguring the New, facing one another from opposite sides of the church, seen from the life of Christ by which he redeemed the human race. The evangelists who recorded the good news, the contrasting wise and foolish virgin, saints who exemplify the true following of Christ, the choirs of angels, and both realistic and symbolic representation of the vices Christians had to eschew, and virtue by which to cultivate. Expressing the sense of the unity of Christendom, the cathedrals included what might be considered as secular scenes, banquets, hunts, even from history. Medieval sculptors occasionally produced male nudes and female figures, Eve, who if not nude were portrayed in sensuous poses. Apparently secular objects might have religious significance, the nut symbolizing Christ, whose divine nature is hidden under his human nature, just as the meat is hidden under the shell. The two wings of dove symbolizing the contemplative and active dimensions of the spiritual life. The pelican as the Eucharist, because it was believed to feed its young with its own blood. Instructions took place on several levels simultaneously. Picture stories for the unlearned, symbolism for the more sophisticated, and for someone perhaps largely subconscious, imbibing the underlying order of creation. On the other hand, Cistercian austerity, despite adopting the Gothic vertically and lightness of structure, had plain glass windows, unadorned walls, and a minimum of statues, as Bernard railed against the decorative religious art for distracting monks from the scripture. He urged the money spent on decoration be given to the poor, although even he acknowledged that people in the world needed a visible support for their faith. The divine proportion was prominent in the construction, although less than in the East. The interior of the church was intended to be itself an experience of heaven, based on the metaphysics of light, expounded by Pseudo Dionysius. Gothic churches were built in accord with a complex and precise geometrical relationship that were not merely aids in efficient construction, but were thought to embody the underlying pattern of the universe itself, placed there by God and disclosed in the measurements of Solomon's temple. As Plato taught, mathematical relationship allowed the mind to move beyond the chaotic physical reality to the eternal order underlying this. It used the quadrivium of mathematical sciences, which is especially important at the Cathedral School of Chartres, and directly influenced the development of the Gothic. The geometric tools, the compass and the ruler, were often depicted, and the number symbolism that came down from Augustine was embodied in all aspects of the church. Baptismal font, for example, was often octagonal, both because Christ was the eighth day of creation and because mankind was allotted 7 ages from birth to death, and eight therefore symbolized the new life. Sculpture of Christ and the saints were majestic and stylized, themselves ordered according to the mathematical proportion as befit the inhabitants of heaven. The Intellectual Renaissance. Monastic and cathedral schools. The monastic remained the center of intellectual life until the 11th century, when, among other things, the increasingly complex requirement of the monastic liturgy left less time for study, and leadership passed to the cathedral school located in towns. Anselm was still part of the monastic culture, but his work helped move theology away from that culture. He felt guilty about pondering philosophical problems while chanting the divine office, and therefore avoided cluniac houses. The one aspect of intellectual life where monks remained important was writing history or chronicles, some of which, although composed for partisan purposes, are the only surviving detailed account of the events of their day. Schools of Chartres. The Renaissance of the 12th century has been called the greatest of all revivals, in that it marked the greatest progress within the shortest period of time. It was centered especially in the school of Chartres, under the direction of John of Salisbury, a Platonist who loved classical literature. But before long, intellectual life moved in a different direction from the humanists of Salisbury, who warned that the emphasis on logic would bring about decline in the study of the liberal arts by making them even insufficiently rigorous. The urge for order. Fragmentary knowledge of Greek, though, has survived through Boethius and Eriugena, especially in the science of logic or dialectic. These parts of the trivium underlie the intellectual revival in the Middle Ages, creating a new way of thinking, abstract, technical, systematic, and came to be called scholasticism, after the school where it found its home. In all aspects of life, there was a new urge for ordered system. Scholasticism was the chief expression of this large movement of increased rationality and of self-consciousness, which also included the codification of canon law, the necessity of free consent to marriage, the outlawing of the ordeals in favor of the judgment of juries, and a formal process of canonizing saints, according to some objective criteria, rather than simply by popular enthusiasm. Scholastic theology. Scholasticism and critical understanding. Scholastics sought to deepen and clarify doctrines by defining them more precisely, something that often involved unfamiliar subtitles or subtleties of technical languages applied to the divine mysteries. The doctrine of transubstantiation was clarified during this time, whereas before, Berengar, making use of the Aristotelian terminology, was condemned for holding that since the appearance, quote-unquote, accidents of bread and wine remain in the Eucharist after the consecration, the underlying reality, quote-unquote, substances of bread and wine must also remain. He taught that the body of Christ was present in that the sign changes, a symbol that is not merely a reminder, but that makes present that which it signifies. Berengar's formula prompted his opponents to insist that communicants actually tear the flesh of Christ with their teeth. Berengar recanted. It was the Lateran form that defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, substance crossing over, or changing, which was later developed by Aquinas' teaching. The Eucharist is unique in being miraculously the sole case in which the unseen substance changes, but the visible accidents remain the same. In every other case, the reverse happens. The size or color of an apple may change, but it remains the same apple. Transubstantiation thus became the accepted Western way of understanding the real present. In logic, faith-seeking understanding was propounded by St. Anselm. The scholastic movement essentially began with Anselm, who pushed the method of logical analysis farther than anyone had up to this time. He defined theology of faith-seeking understanding in that the truth of the faith can be neither proved nor disproved by human reason, but men are obliged to use reason to understand them as far as possible. Without minimizing the importance of Scripture, reason can venture where Scripture is either silent or unclear. Anselm especially uses rational inquiry in his treatise Why God Became Man, where he tried to understand as far as possible the revealed truth of the Incarnation. Anselm's argument for the existence of God was based on the idea of an perfect being, no greater than which can be conceived by the mind. Thus a being may exist, he argued, because perfection implies existence. Finite beings have perfection, but they must derive some perfection from an all-perfect being, without whom the very idea of perfection would be unintelligible. The biblical claim, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, showed that atheism was a failure, not of belief, but of reason. According to Anselm, men do not believe in God, they know that he exists. In philosophy, essence and existence were distinguished by Anselm, who employed the Aristotelian distinction between essence and existence to understand God. Essence being that which a thing is, a man; existence that which it is, a particular man. In God alone, existence and essence are the same, in that its essence is simply to exist, without limit, whereas creature exists only in limited ways. Their essences are restricted by their existence, and limitations define each unique person in contrast to others. In treating salvation and Savior, soteriology at that time was centered on the Passion of Christ, dominated Catholic piety in 2 centuries prior to Anselm, including a deep sense of guilt over the human sinfulness and that had crucified the Savior. Severe penances, as those advocated by the monk Cardinal St. Peter Damian, 1072, were in part an attempt to repay the debt that sinners owed to God and to avert as far as possible God's condemnatory judgment. But to Anselm, no human recompense was possible. Based on Paul and Augustine, he proposed that mankind owed God an infinite, unpayable debt that only a man who was also divine could repay, and which the second person of the Trinity freely and with infinite love took upon himself, suffering and dying to ransom mankind. Anselm also sought to resolve the issue of predestination, proposing that since God exists in an eternal present rather than in time, his will and his knowledge are the same. Nothing that he decreed is in the future, all is in the present. Critics of scholasticism. Some theologians argue about the limits of reason. Since scholasticism in many ways is revolutionary, theology continued to be primarily understood in exposition of Scripture, but it was now done in new ways. Stephen Langton, while a professor in Paris, was the first to divide the Bible into chapters and verses. Peter Damian opposed the growing dominance of logic in the ground that it placed a limit on God, who has the power even to undo what was already occurred and to make two contradictory things both true. The last of the fathers, Bernard, was the most severe critic of the new mode of theology, fearing that it substituted sterile intellectualism for the living teaching of the fathers of the church. Bernard was also one of the last of the monastic theologians, for whom the dominant concern was the salvation of souls rather than the pursuit of knowledge. Bernard's idea of knowledge was as much personal and effective as intellectual. Humility, recognition of one's lowliness, leads to charity, sympathy for others, which lead to compassion, true sorrow, which prepares the way for heavenly contemplation. Mystical theology. The tradition of mystical theology persisted among the Cistercians throughout most of the Middle Ages. Bernard was familiar with the Eastern idea of the progressive deification of the believer, and he saw the mystical experience, or the soul's being taken out of itself and into God, as the culmination of the Christian life. The monastery of St. Victor near Paris remained the center of the more traditional kind of theology. Richard of St. Victor, 1183, to some extent, translated Augustinian ideas into scholastic terms, but de-emphasized the power of reason by emphasizing the cloud of darkness that surrounds God. His colleague Voltaire of St. Victor, 1180, actually cursed logicians, may your dialectics be your damnation. Universities. The cathedral churches were also being superseded because they function somewhat like modern secondary schools, primarily imparting basic knowledge, whereas the intellectual revival of the 11th and 12th centuries required a new institution in which original thinking could take place. Thus, the university was born. In Italy, proudly stimulated by the contact with the Greek and Arabic culture, Bologna and Salerno in Italy, followed by Naples and Padua, were the first universities, a term from Roman law that designated a corporate body, a legal person with its own autonomy. Bologna was the center for canon law, but the other Italian universities were primarily lay institutions, chartered by city governments and organized as student communes for the study of the primarily lay subjects of law and medicine. These medieval institutions already contain the basic feature of the modern university: specialized knowledge, the 3 degrees, bachelor, master, doctor, denoting level of competence and a commitment to intellectual inquiry. The Sorbonne, for which the University of Paris is called the Sorbonne, after the bishop who first chartered it, grew out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame and was a university by 1200. Although it has faculty of medicine, its curriculum is primarily church-related: liberal arts, theology, and canon law, the last probably being the most popular because it led to the employment in church bureaucracies. Oxford and Cambridge in England broke off from Paris in the earlier 3rd century, and the new institution soon spread widely with over 80 universities all over Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. The northern universities remained at least formally under the jurisdiction of the church. Gregory IX rebuked a bishop of Paris for not exercising sufficient oversight over the Sorbonne. The profession of theology in the patristic period, a theologian was simply someone deemed wise and learned in the things of God. Many were bishops, so theology is part of their pastoral responsibilities. But now, a theologian was understood as one who had attained the proper academic credentials, and the dwindling number of bishop theologians were men who had gained the latter status before achieving episcopal office. The theologians, in effect, became a kind of a guild, their primary constituency being in the universities themselves. This discipline required a demand for rigor. The adaptation of Aristotelian logic to theology generated debates that were often even more subtle and different or difficult than those of the fathers, and to some people seemed far removed from the spirit of the gospel. But the stakes were very high. Whether or not believing Christians could make use of the rational capacities to the fullest, following Aristotle, the scholastics demanded not merely opinion or probability, but demonstration, logical argument that it was irrefutable. They adopted the method of disputation as their characteristic way of proceeding, sometimes in the face-to-face debate between adversaries, sometimes in aggressive questioning of a master by his students, above all by the requirement that a thinker accurately states other positions and rebut them. The opposition of earlier thinking were freely cited, but only in supporting evidence. Appeal to authority could not defeat rational argument. The Sentences of Peter Lombard, 1169, was one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages, gathering together the opinions by earlier philosophers and theologians, not for the purpose of setting those questions definitely, but to serve as a basis for further exploration. The theology is called the queen of the sciences. Scientia was the Latin word for knowledge, meaning certitude, and was roughly the equivalent of philosophy, and by no means limited to the physical world. There was no clear definition between philosophy and theology. Philosophical ideas were explored as part of the study of theology, and theology was the queen of the sciences because it involved the highest and most certain truth. In all this, faith and reason became aspects of studies. Since God gave man reason as the highest human power, no authentic discovery of reason was thought capable of denying a dogma of faith. However, since faith dealt with truth far above the human capacity to understand, it was reasonable to rely on faith for knowledge of supernatural mysteries. The dogmas of faith might then reveal ways in which reason erred and might suggest answers to philosophical conundrum. The philosophical concept of the universals were conceived differently. Scholasticism, inquisitive spirit, was first exercised over the question of the universals, how a general concept, tree, could be applied to myriad particular beings, trees. What may have seemed like a mere technical quibble proved have deep implication. Real is still that man mind perceives the individual things and nature that really exists, and that it common to all things of the same species, hence that the mind perceives universals, while nominalists held that the universals are merely names that the mind gives to things that resemble one another without knowing their underlying reality. Clashing point of views. Peter Abelard, 1142, confirmed the misgivings that some people about the new philosophy. At this by his own account, when he appeared as student of Pachari, he drove his professor from the lecture hall by relentless questioning. A brilliant logician, Abelard was in love with the subject and determined to push it as far as he could, which was beyond the point that many people thought valid. He questioned the reality of universals on the ground that there are so many differences among the various things of a particular species that they share no common nature. That nature is merely the mind's attempt to impose order or endless variety. Based on Lombard, he wrote a book called Yes and No, in which he pointed out that he considered to be unresolved contradiction among the opinions of previous thinkers. Contrary to the prevailing theory of Anselm, Abelard seemed to deny the doctrine of the atonement and instead understood Christ's death simply as a revelation of his infinite love, a position that was rejected as inadequate by Bernard and others. Struggling with the logic paradox of the doctrine of the Trinity, Abelard was accused of pointing three gods, and ultimately his work was condemned. The iconoclastic theologian was protected by a large degree by Bernard's own sometime opponent, Peter the Venerable. Abelard was also undone by a seemingly unrelated matter, his love affair with the niece of a prominent priest, a young woman named Heloise, 1164, whom Abelard made pregnant. He and Heloise were both banished to monasteries, where they spent most of the rest of their lives, and later exchanged letters about the sublimation of human love into the divine. Ironically, Abelard became a reforming abbot, whose recalcitrant monk once put poison in his chalice at Mass. Another avenue opens up. Another seemingly distinct understanding resulted from the rediscovery of Aristotle. This is a much greater crisis than the provoked by Abelard, and was the rediscovery in the latter 12th century of not merely Apostle's logic, but his whole philosophy, which has been preserved in libraries in the Near East and translated into Arabic by Muslim scholars. Ironically, since the West lost almost all knowledge of Greek, it was from this Arabic translation that Christians in Spain first learned of the immensity of the Aristotelian thought. Serious thinkers therefore had not to become Aristotelian, because Aristotle, whom Dante called simply the master of those who know, seemed to have offered the most complete and unified account of reality ever attempted, integrating its diverse aspects into a comprehensive system that included physics, psychology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, and finally metaphysics, or beyond physics, the study of the ultimate nature of reality. And so I repeat, Athens and Jerusalem again. The Christian West was suddenly confronted with a comprehensive understanding of reality that was based entirely on reason and completely independent of religious faith, something that seemed to force them to choose between compromising their faith and abandoning their commitment to rational inquiry, a crisis comparable to that of the early church Christian confronting classical paganism, when Tertullian asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Seemingly alien, Averroes and the two truths. The Muslim scholars who developed Aristotle's thought, mainly the North African Avicenna, Ibn Sina, 1037, and the Spaniard Averroes, Ibn Rushd, 1198, laid out a complete system that at key points was directed at odds with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam itself. Averroes held that the Quran could be understood on several levels, depending on the intellectual sophistication of the reader. The various levels should not be confused, and no one should aspire to a level of understanding above his ability. This led to what was later called the theory of two truths. What is true on one level of understanding might not be true at another, although it remains true in its own way. Averroes never explained how faith and reason could be reconciled, and his failure marked the beginning of a wide divergence between Muslim and Christian thought, to the point where Muslim thinkers, who in 1100 had been far in advance of Christians in the study of the physical sciences, increasingly abandoned speculation completely in order to protect the integrity of their religion. This speculative endeavor was continued by the Latin Averroism. The Latin Averroism referred to Christians who continued to take Aristotle completely on his own term and reached conclusions similar to Averroes. It survived in the lay-governed Italian universities, but the mainstream of Christian philosophers held that faith and reason were both avenues to truth, and if followed correctly, could not contradict one another, so that any apparent contradiction showed that one side or the other has failed to follow its own method correctly. Thus the scholastics, beginning in the 12th century, began revising Aristotle's thought to bring it into harmony with divine revelation. Thus philosophy began to be seriously considered. St. Albert the Great, 1280, a Dominican who taught at Paris and became Archbishop of Cologne, was the first medieval thinker to accept philosophy as a self-contained discipline, distinct from theology, distinct that led him to teach that Aristotle's natural human virtues precede supernatural virtues, thereby enabling pagans to lead good lives and possibly to be saved. This harmonization was left to Aquinas. The principal achievement in reconciling Christianity and Aristotle belonged to Albert's pupil Aquinas, an Italian Dominican who spent most of his professional life at Paris. For Aquinas, grace builds on nature, and the reconciliation of the two, the material with the spiritual, the temporal with the eternal, was his great achievement. Aquinas wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles, the highest summary against Gentiles or non-believers, to prove the reasonableness of faith, and the Summa Theologica, the highest summary of theological truth, to understand the faith more deeply. God intended all men to be saved, assumed Aquinas. Thereby, truth must be knowledgeable through reason. Human nature is damaged by sin, so that men see in Paul's eyes or words only through a glass darkly, 1 Corinthians 13:12. But they do retain the light of reason. Faith and reason cannot contradict one another, but the truth of God far transcends finite reason. The pillars. The Aquinas studies that led him to identify the unmoved mover to be God. Aquinas found the argument for existence of God in Aristotle's idea that the universe is a chain of causes, is dependent on the previous causes, all of them dependent ultimately on the prime or unmoved mover or first cause, an impersonal being far removed from a personal God. The universe is eternal because the unmoved mover is eternal and cannot change. Thus, its creative action must also be eternal. This does not run counter to sense knowledge, because Aristotle also is a materialist, as shown in his principle, nothing in the mind unless it was first in the senses, a claim that appeared to exclude even the possibility of knowing non-material beings, and in particular excluded the Platonic Augustinian idea that the mind has innate knowledge of spiritual reality. Whereas earlier Christian theologians following Plato warned against the immense immersion in the world of the senses, Aristotle seemed to say that such immersion was inescapable, which placed believers in a seemingly irresolvable dilemma, since, as the Bible asked rhetorically, no one has ever seen God. John 1:18. The abstruse concept of agent intellect, the faculty by which the mind understands the nature of individual beings, proved to be an especially controversial issue. Avicenna believed that there is only one agent intellect and that it is shared by all men, a doctrine that implied the denial of the individual soul, which is merely part of a larger soul. Daringly, Aquinas affirmed Aristotle's principle that all knowledge begins with sense knowledge, without which the mind is a blank slate. Aquinas was a firm realist for whom each person's agent intellectual, through senses perception, perceives the true nature of things. The biblical doctrine of personal immortality, implying that each person has a distinct, a strong intellect. So also, while the idea of eternal universe might seem logical, Genesis showed that it was in error. Whereas Augustinians believe that the soul is by nature oriented towards God, Aquinas followed Aristotle in seeing that mind is primarily oriented outward towards the world. And whereas previous thinkers had treated the soul as an independent entity joined to a body, Aquinas saw the union of the soul and the body as fundamental, with the soul dependent on the body for knowledge, but it was possible to get beyond sense knowledge. Aquinas affirmed because in meditating on such knowledge, the mind realized that, as Aristotle also thought, there must be a chain of causes that brought sensible things into existence. God is known through all these effects in the world, and Aquinas proposed 5 ways by which to know his existence is based on a particular kind of causality, as defined by Aristotle. leading to the ultimate and cause, which Aquinas concluded we call God. Aristotle has proven the existence of God without knowing that the prime mover was God. His prime mover, the first cause, was revealed to be a personal loving God who acts freely rather than out of necessity. Aquinas discussed the being of God. Following Anselm's definition of God as uniting essence and existence, Aquinas took the words of God to Moses in the burning bush, I am who am, Exodus 3:14, as revealing that in Aristotelian term, God is pure being, that which exists fully and without limitation. Central to Aquinas' thought was the analogy of being. Since God is an ultimate cause of all things, some of its perfections can be found in his creation, which reflects the perfection of God himself, although in an imperfect way. This makes possible rational knowledge, not only of God's existence, but of his nature, since his infinite and unlimited form of every good thing, all just, all knowing, all loving, all good. Like his predecessors, Aquinas espoused negative theology, whereby what is affirmed of God must also be denied of him, since all human concepts are ultimately inadequate. Men know God through analogy, in that he is like his creation, yet also unlike it, and he can be defined negatively as without special or temporal limitation, as doing no evil. On intellectual theory, Aquinas held on the primacy of the intellect. Aquinas' ethical theory departed from that of Augustine in holding that the will always desires good and that evil is less a perversion of the will than an error in understanding, the choice of an apparent good over real one. The will naturally desires what is good, and the mind can know good, because good is what which accord with the divine order of creation. Thus, according to natural law, reason understands moral right and wrong on the basis of the inherent purpose of human action. Fornication is wrong because the purpose of sex is procreation and children. Lying is wrong because the purpose of speech is to communicate truth. With these things came the Thomistic ascendancy. Along with Augustine, Aquinas, the most influential thinker of history of the Catholic Church, the importance of whose achievement can hardly be exaggerated. He would in many ways dominate Catholic thought ever afterward, but his ideas remain to some extent controversial, especially in his denial of the Augustinian idea of the direct divine illumination of the soul. Certain scholastic positions were condemned by the Church authorities shortly after Aquinas' death, although, for the most part, those condemnations remained dead letters. Thomism survived and flourished, becoming the official Dominican system, but no school was completely dominant, and there was considerable debate among scholars, including some who remained Platonists in the face of the triumph of Aristotle. From another theological tradition came Bonaventure. Bonaventure was the founder of the Franciscan theological tradition that was primarily Augustinian and that diverged from Aquinas in certain important ways. According to Bonaventure, the mind does not see the image of God in the world, but understand them only by looking within itself, where it receives direct divine illumination and is impelled by a love that draws the soul inexorably towards God in mystical contemplation, since this requires the free response of the individual. Bonaventure's theology was also Augustinian in giving primacy to the will of the intellect in the discovery of truth. The physical sciences, as understood at that time, includes physics. Physics was the recognized branch of Greek philosophy and was studied even in the Dark Ages. The school of Chartres took considerable interest in the subject, mainly in Platonic terms, and Euclid's geometry was rediscovered at the same time as Aristotle's philosophy, both giving new impetus to the study of nature. Medieval philosophy created the intellectual environment which made the scientific study of nature possible, in that nature had been created by the all-powerful God who stood above his creation, meaning that nature itself did not partake of divinity and thus could be studied objectively. While understanding the universe as part of the ultimate divine order, medieval thinkers sought to explain it as far as possible in natural ways, minimizing direct divine intervention. Monotheism assumed an underlying order in the universe, which man was endowed by the Creator with the ability to discover. Medieval science anticipated modern sciences in some ways. Albert the Great was the observant botanist, for example. Some philosophers speculated that the universe was composed of atoms, and others struggled towards the concept of gravity. The universe in the Middle Ages, most educated people in the Middle Ages believed that the earth was round and that the universe made up of a series of concentric spheres, that of the earth being at the lowest, surrounded by other spheres that were increasingly rarefied as they rose closer to the heavens. Matter was understood in terms of its various substances, summarily earth, air, fire, and water. Supernatural magic was from the devil and hence condemned, but natural magic was the rediscovery by reason and experiment of the hidden secrets of nature, a study, alchemy, that was in some ways the forerunner of modern experimental sciences. The understanding of mathematics. Aristotle thought it possible to understand the world through the nature of its being, flying to understand the motion of the arrow, for example, by speculating about something within the arrow. It was an approach that ultimately proved unfruitful, and its chief defect was its neglect of mathematics, which was a characteristically Platonic rather than Aristotelian pursuit. Plato thought of concrete beings as mere shadows of transcendent forms, did not possess a nature of their own, and could therefore be studied only by the mathematical measurement of its behavior. The Franciscans were more mathematically inclined, perhaps because their philosophical approach was more Augustinian, hence more Platonist than Dominicans. The English Franciscan bishop and philosopher Robert Grosset accepted the pseudo-Dionysian belief that the universe was constituted by the emanation of light from a divine source, but he also approached light in a scientific way and saw the importance of empirical observation. Another Franciscan, his pupil Roger Bacon, 1292, also a Franciscan, also engaged in empirical observation, invented a kind of a telescope and urged that technology be used to improve the condition of human living. He was imprisoned for a time, possibly for practicing astrology, but he was not a religious skeptic. To the contrary, he urged the church to use science in the struggle against infidels. The presence of medieval technology. In Bacon's day, China was probably the most technologically advanced society in the world, but the West was in the process of surpassing it through practical innovations in building, navigation, weaponry, and agriculture, as well as in miscellaneous inventions like eyeglasses. The church itself made extensive use of technology, especially in building. They only condemned the occasional inventions such as the catapult or the crossbow, which was deemed too destructive. The condemned weapon continued to be used anyway, even on the Crusades. The scholastic achievement. Like the fathers of the church who embraced the classical learning, the scholastics had a profound effect on Western civilization in developing and handing on Greek tradition of critical thinking. Scholasticism, a comprehensive system that sought to understand every aspect of reality in relation to the whole, expressed the idea of Christendom itself, the organization of the entire universe, according to an overriding spiritual principle. The Divine Comedy. This sense of unity was carried to its highest point by Dante, whose Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, was the most vivid expression of that ideal, bringing together abstract doctrine and concrete humanity in a great imaginative unity, an epic drama that revealed the divine plan and the way in which divine justice governed the universe. In the comedy, Dante, lost and spiritually imperiled by his illicit and unrequited love for the memory of a deceased married woman named Beatrice, received from God, at Beatrice's entreaty, the guidance of the Roman poet Virgil, who took him on a tour to hell and purgatory to show him the reality of sin. Heaven and hell were described only vaguely in the Bible, and the Catholic images of those places derive in great part to the Divine Comedy. Hell. Dante's tour of hell revealed that punishment for sin was not an arbitrary divine decree, but rather the pattern of human behavior carried into eternity, with the sinner suffering in ways that were the natural and inevitable result of his earthly behavior. The lustful blown helplessly about dry leaves because they allow their passions to dominate them. The gluttonous force-fed to the point of continuous regurgitating their food. The hypocrites weighed down by heavy laden robes and appear beautiful on the outside. The men and women in hell were shown to be not so much damned by God as having damned themselves by refusing to repent of their choices and accept the grace that would have enabled them to overcome their vices, either during their lives on earth or in purgatory. The hierarchy of sins. Dante delineated hierarchy of sin that, as a Thomist, he based on human reason. Thus the worst sin were lying, deceit, and treachery, the use of the intellect to subvert the truth rather than disclose it. Those guilty of such sins, especially Judas, was trapped in ice in the lowest depths of hell because of their calculating and unloving act of betrayal. Purgatory, an equivalent area of sinners, were in purgatory, where, however, they had the joy and certainty of eventual salvation, their crucial difference from the souls in hell being in the fact that they had repented and accepted divine mercy. The sufferings of purgatory were not so much punitive as therapeutic, but purifying the soul and making it worthy of paradise. Heaven. Virgil could show Dante the nature of evil because as a good pagan, the Roman poet understood the natural law. But also as a pagan, he could not enter heaven. As those gates, Beatrice herself became Dante's guide. Since by her prayers, Dante's disordered human love has been transformed into an understanding of divine love. Beatrice guided Dante through the levels of paradise in an upward spiritual journey that was the reverse of his journey through hell and purgatory. The experience of paradise is overwhelming, that the light so bright that it obscured much of what Dante encountered, of which he was not yet as worthy in his spiritual ascent. He encountered the great saints, who, led by their words and deeds, illustrated the hierarchy of virtues. His final guide in paradise was Saint Bernard, Dante as author giving him the honor of the role because Bernard had reached the height of contemplation and because of his deep devotion to the Virgin Mary. Dante was finally drawn upwards to the ultimate union of love with truth. Like a wheel that at the whole rotates, my yearning and my will were borne along with the love that moves the sun and all the stars. Dante revealed the ordered unity of the cosmos itself, the linkages between heaven and earth.
Okay.
Salamat po, Sir Esti. Ang ganda.
Alright. Hindi tayo makakapag-tanong nga dahil
Opo, overtime na po.
overtime na. Pero yan po yung ano dyan ha. Yung pinag-aralan natin last time ay yung Dark Ages, kung saan merong circumstances na makikita natin kung ano mga na-develop doon ay napasa dito sa Middle Ages. Like your benefices, pinag-usapan natin yung benefices last time. So, na-develop yun and nagkaroon ng development both in the sciences and in philosophy, which pag tinignan nyo po, kasama yan doon sa mga pinag-uusapan natin doon sa mga philosophical subjects natin. Tinatch kanina yung morality, moral theology. Tinatch din yung mga tawag dito, yung mga tungkol sa philosophies na pinag-uusapan na natin doon. The logic, pinag-uusapan natin yun sa personal logic. So kung gusto niyo magkaroon uli ng magkaroon ng understanding doon sa mga bagay-bagay na pinag-uusapan natin ngayon, pag binuksan po natin yung program tungkol sa logic, tungkol sa morality, mag-enroll na lang kayo doon para mas maging klaro yung mga identified na areas na pinag-uusapan natin ngayon. So technically, parang overview, mga nangyayari sa simbahan na nakatulong sa sa kaalaman kung ano yung totoo at kung ano yung hindi. Sa pamamagitan ng reason and faith. Okay pa? So kung meron po kayong mga tanong, pakisulat na lang, padala nyo sa email. Try natin sagutin pag merong area na po pa rin. Ano pa? Sige po.
Okay po, salamat po.
Closing tayo.